The Neoliberal Podcast is part of the Neoliberal Project and made possible by our members and supporters. If you enjoy the podcast and want to become a member of the project, head to neoliberalproject.org/join. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. These members and patrons help cover the podcast's expenses and make it all happen. Thanks for your support and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Paul Williams. Paul is the founder and director of the Center for Public Enterprise, and I know him best for his advocacy for YIMBYism and housing, and particularly public housing, which he frequently writes about. And that's the topic of today's episode, is kind of this intra-YIMBY discussion about whether or not public housing is a good way to help solve the housing crisis that we have in this country. Paul and I think, would both self-identify as YIMBYs, as people who want to build more. And we will see if we can work this out. One person who is potentially more skeptical of public housing, one person who is more of an advocate. So, Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
Very glad to be here. It's been interesting reading some of the things that you've been writing for the last year or two. But before we get into the ins and outs of policy, and I suspect we're probably going to get pretty detailed and pretty wonky in this episode, I think we should take just a second to describe the genesis of how this whole podcast came to be, because it came out of one of the strangest Twitter fights that I've ever seen. So, how would you have described that whole episode? I might let you take this. How would you describe this entire episode that about 2 weeks ago, I think, exploded through housing Twitter?
So, I think describing this fight that happened online requires a little bit of background on kind of housing policy debates. And I like to think of housing policies as kind of being in one of three buckets. Right? There are housing production policies to build more housing. There are tenant protection policies, legal protections for renters, and there are demand side policies, tenant subsidies, and things like that, to help people be able to afford rent. And I think that there are a lot of groups who focus mostly on tenant laws, and there are a lot of groups who focus mostly on land use and zoning and things like production policies. And I think that in general there's this big it turns out that there's a big kind of split between those groups, where one group thinks that the policies that they're advocating for are the only ones that are needed to solve the housing crisis, and the other group thinks that another set of policies are the ones that are needed to solve the housing crisis. But in reality, I think that most people generally agree that a lot of these different things are needed. And these fights really end up just being kind of a culture war thing of, oh, well, you work mostly on this one set of things, and therefore you're not part of my club and I don't like you. And you see that from many people who are involved in the kind of fight. And I think that, yeah, and I mean, this is, this was like what happened on Twitter, with this intra-left YIMBY-NIMBY kind of fight that was happening.
And there's a comedian who is at the center of all this, and I don't even want to say her name, because the point is not to dogpile her, and Lord knows she's been in enough fights on Twitter.com already. She doesn't need any more. So, but there was a comedian who spent a great deal of time basically going after, it seemed like the entirety of housing Twitter, left, right, everybody in between. And it kind of just sparked this moment of like, what are we even doing here? What conversation are we having, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way I have gone about it is like I think that I think that policies in all of those buckets are important and solve different problems that are all necessary to solve the housing crisis more broadly. And so when I see people fighting about them, I'm like, I mean, it makes me sad because it's like we need all of these things and we should all be fighting for them together, because the actual opponents of these major housing reforms are the people who own land, right? Who benefit from the current way things are structured. That's a big enough opponent. We don't need to make opponents out of ourselves.
I will give you credit, I think, for being a much better person than I am. Just so everybody knows, when I saw this whole thing going on, my instinct was to run in and get my dunks while everybody else was dunking on all this dumb stuff as well. And Paul, with the patience of a saint, was was going in and trying to like actually explain, like, no, this is actually, this is a good thing. And like, look, I'm on your team. Paul is a more left-leaning guy than I am, and he's trying to communicate like we're on the same team, and let me explain to you how this is a good thing. And for his efforts, I think you got called a right-winger, a fascist, a sociopath at some point. So I respect you a great deal for trying to fight the good fight and trying to engage in good faith no matter what. So
I muted a lot of people on that website the past couple of weeks. I'll tell you that much.
I mean, if the whole thing got deleted, sometimes I wonder if it would be a net positive. But this whole thing happened. Not to spend the whole episode talking about Twitter.com. This thing happened, and I observed all of this. And at some point, I started thinking, is there any way we can have something productive come out of this? Can we drag out of this muck some sort of intelligent conversation? Because there is actually an interesting divide in a couple ways in the housing community. You have the left NIMBYs versus the left YIMBYs. You also have within the YIMBY movement people who are more left-leaning, who think public housing has to be a big part of this, and some people who are more free market-oriented, who are skeptical of public housing. So that's what led to this episode, was a kind of a desire for this to actually lead to some kind of constructive conversation. So I think a good place to start would be to kind of just square where you and I are, because we're not going to agree on everything here. But I suspect that we're actually starting from a place where we agree mostly. If you and I looked at the same housing policies, we would probably agree on like 95% of them, or at least 85% of them. So yeah. I wonder, could you just for a couple minutes, give me your general philosophy of housing? How do you think about this? What are the policies that you support? And what does your housing future look like in Paul Williams's designed world?
So I think partly it goes back to what I was saying earlier about there kind of being three buckets that I think of housing policies generally as being in, right? There's policies for the production of housing. There's policies to subsidize the demand for housing to help people afford housing. And there are policies that protect people from various kinds of exploitation or ill effects or market failures that might happen. Tenant protection policies. And, and obviously within all of those buckets, there's many different branches of different issues to solve. There's market failures that come up in all of those, and there's different ways to solve them and things like that. I think that one big issue that I've been focusing a lot on lately, particularly because of the news the past couple of weeks, is the fact that housing production in the United States is so highly cyclical. And there's this famous paper called "Housing is the Business Cycle" from 2007 that was presented to folks at the Federal Reserve. One of the many things that it talked about, and other folks have talked about since, is that housing permits are kind of a leading indicator for recessionary risk. And permits, when permits start to fall, and production starts to fall, then construction jobs start to fall, then construction wages start to fall, and you kind of get a little bit of your self-fulfilling prophecy of things turning into a recession. And that's been true for recessions in the United States for the past 50 years. It's just, you just look at you can pull it up on Fred, pull up the unemployment rate and housing permits, and it's pretty obvious what's happening. And I think that is that's extremely bad, and I think that cuts against so many important things. One, obviously, people don't need housing any less during a recession. Perhaps there's less, effective demand for housing, in that, people may have less money in a recession. But people don't stop needing housing in a recession. What happens is you just get people moving into their parents' basements, people piling up with more roommates, and people just paying a lot more than they can realistically afford or should be paying, because the reason for that is we have this pretty cyclical production mechanism. So, that I think is a big thing to solve. And there's a lot of issues that come out of that we can get into. So I guess in my ideal world, I think that one thing is housing production would be a lot more stabilized across the business cycle. That would be a huge thing.
So in terms of the big three that you mentioned, housing policy consists of helping out with the supply problem. There's policy that tries to address why we don't have enough housing. There's policy that addresses demand, people who can't necessarily afford housing. And there's policy that is like regulation, regulatory, tenant protection, that kind of thing. I want to focus mostly on the supply and the demand side. We might have some disagreements about the regulatory protection stuff, but I don't think that's where the most interesting conversation is. I think the most interesting conversations are about how we build the supply and how we subsidize demand in instances where we think that there's, kind of a social safety net reason to do that. So I'm just going to run you through a checklist real quick, because I don't think there's like universal agreement on this, but just let's run through a checklist. As far as the supply side, do you think that market rate housing has a role to play in helping fix the supply side issue?
Yeah.
And do you think that, the general malaise that people talk about of zoning and, endless community board hearings and kind of this whole NIMBY process, are those some of the main obstacles that you think are in the way?
Yeah. Some of them.
And then do you also believe that public housing should play a significant role in kind of addressing this supply side issue?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that's probably the most interesting area of disagreement, because I would agree with you on the first 2 points that we've got to reform zoning, we've got to kind of reform the process itself that allows for some of these horror stories that you hear about of developments in limbo for 5, 6, 10 years. And then we've got to build market rate housing. But I'm a little more skeptical of public housing. And I will say, at this point, the housing crisis is bad enough, and like we are so incredibly supply constrained. At this point, I would say yes to public housing, even though it's not my preferred method. But where we are this moment in time, I don't want to turn down like any supply. So I think we agree on a lot of things here, which is important to emphasize if we have disagreements later in the conversation. But I think we're 95% of the way on the same team here.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I I am happy to come on the Neoliberal Podcast and make a public housing convert out of you if I can. So
wading into enemy territory. Well,
yes.
we do appreciate you being here. So I guess I'll give you kind of just the floor in terms of, for someone who's skeptical, how would you make a case for why public housing should really be a part of this conversation, an important part, because you focus a lot of your work on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a few reasons why public developers and public housing are kind of crucial, not just to getting us out of the supply crisis that we're in right now, but also for keeping us on a stable path into the future. So, I guess I'll start off with kind of where I was going earlier with this question of stability across the business cycle. So this I think is actually a pretty important one, and plays a lot into some of the other slightly more nuanced difficulties in the housing sector right now. So one thing that a lot of people talk about is how construction has had relatively low productivity gains over the past couple of decades in the United States, or I mean, really over the past 50 years in the United States, and that's a significant problem because productivity gains really just translates into larger per unit costs, not just for affordable housing, which is the per unit costs we hear about all the time, but also private development per unit costs are also higher in the United States than they are in some other places where productivity gains have been realized in the construction industry.
And a lot of times you hear this as time periods too, not just cost but time, where
Totally.
We built the Empire State Building in 400 and something days, which is true and amazing. And now we can't build an elevator to reach a subway station in less than 3 years. It's that kind of thing drives people crazy, and I think it should.
Totally. And there's some really interesting stuff on this with the cyclicality I was talking about earlier. So in 2008, really 2006 and 2007 is when permits started to fall first, and then when you had employment start to rapidly fall in 2007 and 2008. A lot of that was in the construction industry, and it took an incredibly long time for those construction jobs to be brought back into the economy. And it took an incredible that is not only bad for people who work in the construction industry, who obviously either are out of work or working less or have to find a new profession. That's also bad for construction as an industry and construction productivity, because you're losing all of these you're losing all of the benefits of a lot of people working together all the time. I mean, that's how you get productivity gains, is you have a lot of people doing a lot of different things, competing and trying to do better, right?
This is something Alain Levy talks about with regards to transit specifically, that American transit
Totally.
is bad because in some sense we don't have a lot of frequent repeatable processes. There are other countries where they build this so regularly that they've got it down to a science, whereas every city here is always figuring it out on their own every time. And but so if I can get where you're going, you're kind of going in a direction of public housing projects and public housing spending as a almost Keynesian counter-cyclical kind of fiscal policy.
Totally, yes. And if you can stabilize some of that production across the business cycle and not have these huge drops in construction employees that take, it always, takes more time for the line to go back up than it does for the line to go down. And all of that is lost time and lost productivity gains and all of those things. And so if you can stabilize that production better across the business cycle, you can have more productivity growth, and you can have more wage growth, and you can have more of all of these things that are good. And so, this maybe, I can transition a little bit into, okay, how do you actually do that then, right? How do you actually, quote unquote, stabilize, your housing production across the business cycle?
I will say this is a very different argument than most people will give for public housing. Most people, if they're talking about public housing, it comes from a more philosophical commitment, I think, to kind of nationalizing certain sectors of the economy, or just the government should be involved in things like this, direct provision of goods like this, and not as kind of like fiscal policy. Like what I noticed that almost nothing there was, about solving the housing crisis that we've got, as much as like that might be a side benefit, but your main goal is more like a Keynesian policy here.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm also a person in this world, and I know how to tailor my arguments to who's listening. So, I'm starting with something that I think you and your audience would be receptive to. I could make the philosophical arguments as well, and I hold those values too. So, but I don't think that's the argument that's going to get the listeners of the Neoliberal Podcast to change their mind, right? So,
fair enough. So, I mean, one thing that I always think about with Keynesian policy is whether or not people are willing to go at both ends of it, because the classic version of a Keynesian stimulus program is that you spend in times of recession, but then you pull back when times are good. And would that kind of apply in this situation? Because we've been living in this world where, inflation has been low for a decade, and it kind of seemed for a minute like, oh, we can just run deficits and spend as much money as we want. We even had MMT become a thing, but that crowd has been suspiciously quiet now that inflation is approaching 10%, and it really seems like the economy is running hot in many respects. And not to do like a deep dive into inflation and how much is demand and how much is supply driven, but that's one question I would have if we have like housing policy as kind of subservient to macroeconomic fiscal policy. Is it going to be willing to go both ways? Obviously it would be helpful in spending to get us out of a recession or to prevent one, but would housing have to pull back in times when the economy is hot like it is right now?
Well, I mean, I would actually say that right now is precisely the time when there should be significant amounts spent on public development. I don't know if you saw last week, but housing permits over the month were down 14% in May, partially as a result of the rate increases from the Federal Reserve and the anticipation of quantitative tightening. Selling some of the mortgage-backed securities from the Fed's balance sheet, which caused mortgage, 30-year mortgage rate to more than double over the past, 5 months. So, what happened there is home builders were building homes, both multifamily and single family, and there were a lot of people who could who could afford to buy one of those homes with mortgages at 2-3%. But now mortgages are close to 6%, and home builders are just pulling back, and they just like dropped off on permits very quickly. But obviously, the supply problem of housing has not been solved, but the private market stopped. They like really pulled back strong this past month, and presumably they're going to continue pulling back next month because mortgage rates are only going higher still. And so that's a problem is like these tools that we have at the macroeconomic level right now of, the interest rate. I mean, these things that we can do to increase the production of housing, it's a blunt instrument, right? Like they're hiking interest, the Fed is hiking interest rates to like try to solve the kind of elevated price level across the economy right now. But what's actually happening is it's going to tank housing production, which is where a lot of inflation is going to be over the next 6 to 12 months. And obviously, housing production is counter-inflationary, right? We don't want to tank housing production. We should have policies that increase housing production. Unfortunately, what the Fed is doing is having the opposite effect. And so that's another case for having, policy tools like public development that are not just a blunt cudgel on the macroeconomy, like the policy rate is, that can address some of the more specific issues directly. That this is kind of the argument for looking at public development as essentially macroeconomic policy, right? It allows some macroeconomic issues to be addressed without using that blunt instrument of the policy rate.
There's shades in here of an idea that's been popularized, I think, both on the left and the center left. Ezra Klein calls this supply side progressivism, I think.
Yeah.
I've also heard we need a liberalism that builds. I've heard Derek Thompson call this the abundance agenda. It's a fair point that if you want to tackle an inflationary environment, you can either reduce demand or you can increase supply. Both of those are valid ways to try to lower the price level. And so increasing supply is one way to do it. But I think that leads me into the next kind of area of questions I have. There's a couple reasons why I am skeptical of public housing, and some of it is about the way that it is done. Because I think it's a great idea in the abstract. If we could just increase the supply of housing, I am 100% for that. But the actual mechanisms by which we try to do public housing in this country are typically, to my eyes, pretty terrible. And that public housing seems to frequently be mired in incredibly high costs, and they produce low quality housing. And, I've could list off these examples that I'm sure you've heard before about how, NYCHA in New York is kind of the least popular landlord in the city. They get the worst rankings. They objectively have the most serious issues by far. There's all these things about how public housing, when you actually get to the practicalities of how it actually works, doesn't do very well. The money is not well spent. So I'd love to ask your perspective on that.
Yeah,
America doesn't seem to build public housing in a good way. There are other countries that have similar problems to this. There are other countries that seem to do public housing better than we do. So I don't know if maybe we start there about what does a good public housing system look like versus a really crappy one.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think interestingly enough, a lot of the problems that came out of, a lot of the problems with the public housing programs in the United States stem from opponents of the program amending the legislation in 1937 to kind of handicap it. So the original idea for public housing in the United States came out of this kind of group of planners and union activists in the early 1930s. Catherine Bauer was kind of the ringleader of this group and worked pretty closely with the Public Works Administration to kind of create the housing division in 1935 and get a little bit of enabling legislation passed. And the programs that they ran for those first couple of years were subsidized loans to operate at-cost housing. Right, so the housing authorities were essentially making most of their revenue, most of their costs back through revenues, through rents, and they rented the apartments they built at low cost, but they were eligible to, almost all people, right? So, you obviously you had a lot of lower income folks moving in because they were like, this is great. This is like a nice, high quality apartment that's low cost. And you had, moderate income folks moving in as well because they saw the same benefit, right? A low cost apartment that's high quality, in a desirable location. And the problem with that is that the real estate lobby at that time at the national level, particularly in the cities where these public housing projects were being built, saw that as a threat to their business model. Even though they weren't barely building any housing at the time. It was the Depression. And so in 1936 and 37, there were amendments made to the Housing Act that basically said the apartments can only be rented to people in this very small band of incomes at the very bottom of the income scale, which necessitated that the federal government, would have, a mandate to provide the subsidies to pay the difference between the rents and the actual costs. Which is a good thing. The federal government should be, paying for that demand, but it put the local housing authorities in a position where they were entirely dependent on the federal government for those payments. They weren't building anything mixed income or at cost that could help sustain them. And the other thing that was put in place was that the public housing authorities were banned from essentially competing for land with private entities, such that the only places public housing authorities were allowed to build was in slum clearance designated zones. So the program was very much handicapped, and there's fantastic books going over the history of this. There's a great one called Modern Housing for America by a historian named Gail Radford up in Buffalo.
And do you think this is why, for instance, the public housing has the reputation of, I suppose, number one, it has the reputation because in many ways it is actually deficient, but you think this is kind of what caused some of that deficiency? And this, because the people who kind of did the policy work back in the 1930s, there's these incredible quotes in this book by Gail Radford where they're essentially saying, like, yes, the amendments that were made by the real estate industry are going to kill this program in the future, and that's exactly what happened, right? We get through your namesake, the neoliberal era in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and Ronald Reagan makes changes to the public housing program, and it's really Bill Clinton who kind of puts the nail in the coffin on the Section 9 public housing program with changes to the capital funding formula in 1997 or 98. One of the things I would ask about here is the cross-national comparison, because like I said, like there's a reputation for public housing. Like I grew up not too far from the projects in air quotes, and I didn't live in the projects, but I knew where they were, and they were public housing, and they were terrible. Everybody knew what you meant if you said you lived in the projects, and that had like a reputation, whether you can argue whether it was deserved or not, or what the impacts of that reputation are, but it definitely had a reputation. But that's not just an American thing. It can't be explained solely by American legislative factors, because you see a similar thing in the UK, where if you say you're from the council estate, that carries a certain reputation. There's a meaning to that beyond just I live on my city's public housing block.
Sure.
I kind of looked up a couple other countries, and this is kind of a common thing, that if in many places, if you say they have like a specific term for their public housing, and it carries a societal connotation of like, oh, you don't want to live there, that's bad, that has a bad reputation. So I'm curious about, like, are there places that do it better? Because I'm sure you would argue there are places that have much more successful public housing.
Yeah. The top example, or the most extreme example would be Singapore, where literally 90% of the country lives in public housing. And so, and realistically, it's the people who are the poorest. It's the people at the very bottom and probably some people at the very top of the income ladder who live in private housing. Right. And so, if you're lower income and not living in public housing, that would be the negative connotation, right? Like, oh, you don't live in our wonderful, beautiful public housing across the country of Singapore. That would carry the negative connotation, right? And the way they do it there is, they just have one large national construction company called the Housing Development Board that essentially, it has there's a kind of public bank that makes no interest loans to the Housing Development Board to build these projects, and they just build to demand and to population, and they just they do pretty serious planning and tie the projects to all of the transit infrastructure projects and other economic development work that's going on in the city state.
I think that word right there is one of the important ones, city state, because it's totally, funny. Yeah. I normally have to do this with people who are a little bit more like authoritarian, right? And who will talk about Singapore as some kind of model of like why democracy isn't, really totally necessary. And I always have to be like, remember, like, governing one city state is not the same thing as governing a whole multi-ethnic 100 million plus person country. Like, let's just keep that in mind. But
totally,
I mean, totally. But it is always really interesting to see how they do things there. It's a very interesting place.
Yeah, right. And I mean, the politics and a lot of other social policy in Singapore is obviously something there's a lot of things I don't think are good and a lot of things I think are very illiberal. But the Housing Development Board is very much a success story in the ability to, essentially provide high quality housing for all. That country has very much succeeded at that goal in a very real way. Another example, though, is where you don't have that stigma and you have a lot of success, but you do have, kind of countrywide is Austria. And, obviously Vienna is the biggest city in Austria, and Vienna is pretty well known for its kind of social housing programs. But in Austria, roughly half of the population lives in social housing of some kind. And obviously there's a few different kind of branches of different kinds of social housing in that country, right? There's housing that's the kind of the through line between all of these different types is that there's public financing put into it and an aspect of public ownership, right? Some of it is done with these kind of nonprofit developers who run these special programs. Some of it is done by municipal corporations. So you have this kind of mix.
Yeah, because I guess it's a good thing to specify what we're talking about. When we say public housing, is it just the government gives the money, but then a private developer builds it for the government and then also manages it for the government? Or is it the government is actually like they are doing the building, they are the construction company, they are the building company, they are the management company? Right. What do you envision when you talk about this? Because obviously it can kind of mean different things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily, I wouldn't go around prescribing, a particular, structure in that sense. I think there's a lot of different things that work in a lot of different contexts. An example, to get into a little bit of specifics here on the United States and what I'm thinking about here is, so the example I'll give is the Public Housing Authority in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is, county just outside of Washington, D.C., in Maryland. They're a typical United States public housing authority. They built a lot of Section 9 traditional public housing in the 70s. Now they've done, they also, have some other types of affordable housing, Section 8 project-based voucher housing and a number of other types of projects. And they also do a lot of preservation, buying old buildings and preserving them as affordable and things like that. What they started doing a few years ago is really interesting, though, and I think it's a direction that presents a lot of opportunities for public housing authorities or other state housing agencies across the country to kind of mimic parts of what they're doing, to start to do some of these things I was talking about earlier, like trying to stabilize production across the business cycle, and importantly, to be able to provide more low rent housing than the current set of subsidies that the federal government has allow for. And so basically what they do is essentially what they did is the county gave them some funds to capitalize this revolving loan fund, and they use that revolving loan fund to loan into projects that they want to build. And this money replaces what in a private deal would be private equity, which typically, runs at a pretty high cost. Private equity or mezzanine loans or any of these other kind of expensive forms of capital are going to be, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15% rates on them. They're loaning this capital into their projects from their revolving fund at 4 or 5%, or lower if they want to, and that allows them a great deal of flexibility in their rent setting. And then the other piece is that because they're a public developer and a public owner, they don't have their own margin to hit, right? Obviously, they want to make they need to be able to pay their mortgage back. They need to be able to make their debt payments, and they need to have a little bit of room on top of that, to avoid any risk. But they don't have their own margin they need to hit. So those two things combined really give them a lot of flexibility to do a lot of low rent units, subsidized apartments in those buildings. So apartments, and this is the kind of idea with cross subsidy, right? You have some apartments in this building that are higher cost or market rate, and you have some apartments in a building that are lower cost and for folks on lower incomes. And
this is an argument, though, that always strikes me a little false, because it's kind of a classic left argument that provision of a certain good would be cheaper if we nationalized it, because the profit incentive is gone. We can essentially run this without profit, without the private equity taking its chunk. And in theory, that sounds great, that you can run this as a nonprofit, and because you're saving on the profit, this will be cheaper in the end. But the reality that I see is that, in Los Angeles, they've got public housing projects where it's literally something like $1 million a unit, and that housing costs on these kind of things tend to spiral out of control in most instances. I'm not as familiar with Montgomery County as I am with New York's situation or with what's going on in California, because that's where the housing crisis tends to be the worst. But how do you think about places like that where they have not controlled costs, and in fact costs are like spiraling out of control like crazy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, part of the problem with costs on, so that article that you were talking about where California per unit costs are up to $1 million, that's not public housing. I mean, there are really no public housing authorities that are building public housing right now. That's for affordable housing, mostly funded with the low-income housing tax credit. Low-income housing tax credit is a program that came out of the Reagan Tax Reform Act of '86, and the way that program works is you get affordable, nonprofit affordable housing developers will say, I want to build an affordable housing complex. in order to pay for it, they need to get a loan, and they'll go out and get a mortgage that'll cover somewhere from 40 to 60% of their project costs, and then they will get a kind of slew of grants and subsidies to cover the remaining costs on the project. The biggest of which is the equity from the low-income housing tax credits. Sorry, this is super wonky, but like it's important to know how this program works, because it helps to show part of why some of those costs are spiraling out of control. So the way low-income housing tax credit works is a nonprofit developer applies for the credits. They get awarded the tax credits. Then, in order to get the money from that, they have to sell those tax credits to an equity investor who wants the credits in order to reduce their tax burden. So typically the people who buy these tax credits are banks, hospitals, other large local institutional investors, things like that. But obviously these little nonprofits don't have any ability to do all the syndication and underwriting and all of this activity that has to be done to for these pretty complicated tax credit transactions. So they have to hire a whole team of attorneys and a whole team of underwriters, and there's this pretty large industry of people who essentially take their fees from these low-income housing tax credits that are supposed to be going to building affordable housing. That's one piece of it. A second piece of that is that because these projects are expensive and they take a long time to put together, that adds significant amounts of cost because these nonprofit developers have to stack 10 different types of funding from 10 different sources in order to make their project work. And that all just adds to increased costs. So, partly it's the complicated nature of the funding mechanisms that contributes to high costs. There's also some perverse incentives where in a lot of places, the developer fee, which is the amount of money that the nonprofit developer gets for building the project, is just a percentage of total project costs, which is obviously does not incentivize keeping project costs down. In fact, it does the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair when you're talking about LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credit projects. But to me, I've seen that be true even with stuff like NYCHA, which is more of a. I don't think NYCHA is done with low-income housing tax credits, is it?
No. NYCHA's not really building anything new right now, although they did just pass the Preservation Trust, which is going to allow them to do some really significant portfolio-wide upgrades and rehabilitation projects. They're going to, the plan is to have the entire portfolio carbon neutral, I think by 2040. So, they're developing their own heat pump technology that is going to work specifically on a lot of their older housing stock. And they now have a financing mechanism that's going to allow them to do that. So I'm very excited about that. I
will say improves because they are woeful in how they manage their properties. And we can talk about whether that's because they're underfunded or whether it's just because the government is always terrible at managing things, which is something that my more libertarian friends would say. But they definitely are very poor, whatever the reason.
Yeah, I will argue all day long that it's because their funding was essentially slashed in 1998. You could have put the best management team, most well-intentioned and everything there, 2000 through 2015, and you would have 98% of the same problems that it has right now. I mean, the funding was slashed. I think a lot of people do not realize how significant the reduction was in the capital budget. I mean, in fact, I know it's the case because people who make this argument that it's a management issue, I mean, there's no way to make that argument when you look at the numbers. So,
how would you think about something like one of the arguments I see is that costs to build are substantially higher for these kinds of projects, whether it's kind of a LIHTC inclusionary zoning scheme or whether it's public housing, but that it's just that the government requires a lot more than the market will in terms of labor standards, in terms of union contracts, in terms of regulations about the floor plan and unit size and environmental things, and just that all these kind of things add up and they lead to a much more difficult build, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think, on building code stuff, I think there's a lot of building code reforms that need to happen that can reduce costs, and there's a lot of productivity gains that we need to realize with more sustained levels of production across time that public investment and public developers can help with. But I will say, Montgomery County, they're building these new mixed income projects today. I mean, as we speak, they have shovels in the ground. They're about to close on another project. They have 2 more in the pipeline. These projects are all under, around $300,000 per unit, which is much lower than the affordable housing average in that area, right? They're keeping project costs low because it's important to them and because they want to. I think that one of the reasons that project costs have not been kept low in certain places and with certain programs is because nobody has been incentivized to do so. In Montgomery County, the way that their program is set up, where they have a certain size revolving loan fund and they're doing these mixed income projects that kind of self-finance, there's a very strong incentive to keep project costs low, because that means the lower your per unit cost, the more projects you can build and the more units you can build, right? They don't have this kind of steady stream of revenue that'll just pay whatever the cost is. So they do a very good job. And I think that those are, a lot of those, similar types of incentives exist in other countries where public housing programs are successful. And so, I get a little, I don't know, I roll my eyes a little bit when the project cost, or the government's bad at managing, the government was bad at managing this thing this one time. It's like, I'm not proposing to do anything poorly. I'm proposing specifically that things are done well. And there are places where things are done very well, and that is what I think we should do. Yes, there are poorly managed government projects. There are also fantastically managed government projects, right? The Tennessee Valley, I mean, nobody would say the Tennessee Valley Authority is poorly managed. I have never heard that from anyone. People who make that argument that government manages things poorly just don't talk about Tennessee Valley Authority.
We're going to have that one listener who just hates the Tennessee Valley Authority for some reason. Well, I won't know anything about it, but they'll send me an angry letter, I promise you. But let's talk about the political realities, though, because that was something I wanted to get to was, obviously it would be an unfair standard looking at market rate versus public housing and like, taking the typical case of one and then the worst case of the other. In either direction, that would be an unfair thing to do. But I do think it's important to think about the typical case and what we can reasonably expect to happen. And one of the things that will happen in America, Democrats have a trifecta right now for at least a few more months, but Republicans are going to come back into power. That is a certainty. Yeah. If not in 2022 or 2024, at some point, there will be people who kind of oppose this kind of thing. And even if the full argument is that, public housing has been left to wither on the vine by its political opponents, those opponents still exist. And it kind of seems like, do we want our housing strategy to be to be contingent on Democrats retaining power indefinitely, basically.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, and I don't think that there's any realistic possibility of getting federal support for any of these kind of newer models of public developers, really anytime in the next, 8 years, 6 years, maybe. I mean, the whole approach that I work on now is working with public housing authorities that already exist. Public housing authorities are not federal agencies. They are deputized by HUD to do work on behalf of HUD, but they are all local agencies established at the state level, right? So, like, New York City Housing Authority is an agency of New York State. It's been deputized by HUD to do work on behalf of HUD, but it's a local agency, and it can do things that it's authorized to do under state law, and that's precisely how Montgomery County, Maryland's housing authority is kind of operating right now. There's this kind of when people talk about public housing, often talk about the Faircloth Amendment, which was an amendment to one of Bill Clinton's housing reform laws in the late 90s that essentially capped the number of total apartments that HUD would pay for under Section 9. And so, basically said, hey, local housing authorities, you can't, if you build any more, we're not going to pay you for it. Look, so, this is kind of what Montgomery County, though, is doing is they're like, okay, well, I'm still allowed to build housing. I don't need your money to pay for it. I will do this cross-subsidy approach and pay for it myself. I don't need the federal government to subsidize this. I don't care if Congress is Republican or Democrat, because if I'm self-financing and cross-subsidizing, I don't care whether they're giving me subsidy or not. Obviously, it would be, from that public housing authority's point of view, it would be helpful if they could have, access to programs that had lower interest loans, or interest rate subsidies of some other form, or other forms of helpful credit, or even just technical assistance from HUD on helping to develop programs like this. But having those is not a necessity if you're doing this kind of cross-subsidized approach. So, and that's another argument that I make. There are to people that a model like this is really kind of budget cut proof, right? Like you can go ahead and cut the budget for Republicans could go ahead and cut the budget for HUD programs, but Montgomery County is not using really any HUD money to do this. They're literally just in real terms, they're just kind of running their own business, right? Like they're making their payments on their own because they have some market rate units in these buildings that allows them, to break even and then some a little bit. You can't stop that with a budget cut.
I think that makes sense. One other thing that frustrates me about this entire conversation from a political angle rather than a policy angle is that, and I think this is a little bit unfair to you personally, but I think that a lot of the public housing conversation that happens tends to accidentally empower NIMBYs. Because this kind of alternative exists, we can kind of draw up a way in which, what we really need is social housing, public housing. Sometimes I include inclusionary thing here. We need units, buildings where it's 50% affordable. And because some of these things are sometimes advocated for, it gives NIMBYs kind of this shield to hide behind. Well, I'm going to vote no on this market rate housing because what we really need is public housing. And maybe they never intend to vote for any housing whatsoever. And like I said, this is kind of it's a little unfair to dump that on your plate, but
no,
it's a dynamic that I see that just drives me up the wall. I don't know.
Totally. No, as a person who, essentially spends my days working with public housing authorities, legislators, and organizations who are trying to, put forward these models and get some of, get programs like this stood up across the country. That dynamic bothers me too, because it's like yes, like we should have public housing and social housing. We literally don't have programs to do it almost anywhere in the country right now. Like it's going to take us some time to get those programs up and running, and to get any of them to any reasonable scale that they'll be able to address the problem. And the idea that no housing should be built in the meantime is obviously, not just, it's bananas,
All right, so since I kind of unloaded on you there with just my personal frustrations with housing, let me ask you the same question. Is there anything that frustrates you about this discourse as somebody who spends a lot of time advocating for different models of public housing? Is there anything about this that market rate YIMBYs or right-leaning YIMBYs say that kind of just frustrates you and you wish you could like snap at them or whatever?
No, not really. I mean, to be frank, I'm
come on, Paul. So you got to start a fight here. Just no, I'm just it's no, good. I mean, if there's nothing, there's nothing. But.
I mean the the fight that I'm gonna start is we're going to establish public developers across the country who are going to compete rentiers out of the market, and like that's the fight I'm interested in.
One of the things that I always think about with this, when you talk about rentiers, rent in the economic sense of like, I'm extracting a rent from you because I have an advantageous market position or whatever. I think that some people are confused between developers and landlords. And like, I love developers. Developers are my favorite people because they're going through the mind-boggling fights to actually try to get new housing built. Landlords, everybody seems to hate their landlord. Everybody's got a bad landlord story. If you live in especially a big urban area, like I live in New York, everybody in New York can tell you like a horror story about a bad landlord they had. But I think people just kind of confuse those two vague housing authority figures when really they're like have opposite, diametrically opposed like interests sometimes.
Yeah. I would, maybe diametrically opposed it would be a bit of a stretch, or, maybe it's true in a very highly idealized sense, but yeah, I mean, this is the difference between, it's an owner, versus a producer, right? It is a landholder versus a, producer. And, I think, if you go back to, the neoclassical economists, and even some of the, kind of marginal revolution folks, the opposition among all of those economists to landowners being able to extract economic rents was unanimous.
Oh yeah, this is something I love to talk about with the original like liberal philosophers. They were kind of inciting a rebellion against the aristocracy and like the landholding class. That was
totally
liberalism. I like to think of liberalism as like the history of liberalism is fighting against unearned, entrenched interests. And the original one was that landowning class in in England and France.
Totally, yeah. And this, I mean, right. Like all of those and obviously, Henry George, who was not an economist, kind of went the furthest with this, with the land value tax and his whole book. But a lot of these economists that were around at the same time, read and agreed with it, even if they, thought that his, some of his economic reasoning was a little bit ill-informed. But yeah, I mean, I think that distinction between producer and rentier, rentier in the sense of just owning something and collecting economic rents from it is often missed by people. And I think there's also a lot of people who even see the developer as worse, right? And I think I don't know, something that's like a personal thing where like a lot of times or sometimes with your landlord, you at least like know that there's a person with a face who like you can call, like even if they don't fix things quickly or whatever, like at least you know it's a person, right? With a large building going up, you're just like, I have no idea who that is. What are they, a real person? It's like it's depersonalized in a way that I don't know, maybe that contributes a part to it. I can't really say.
So we're coming up on time soon, but we've got time for just one or two more questions. One thing that I'm curious about is that this seems to be the idea of public housing is both a supply side initiative and a demand side initiative. We've spent a lot of time talking about supply, but one of the three things that you mentioned was demand as well, that there should be some housing policy for people who can't afford to make their rent, basically. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. So I guess in two questions here, in a general sense, how do you see that interplay of supply and demand happening? And in the second sense of just we need to help people, why is public housing or affordable units or something like that better than just, say, giving people cash, giving people vouchers, kind of the straight cash approach, UBI or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that's a fair question. And realistically, I think that those demand side benefits that you're talking about, giving people housing subsidy, like cash, actually go hand in hand with a model like this. And in fact, that is having housing benefits that are cash like that is actually how a lot of the highly successful kind of social housing programs in many of these other countries actually work. So, Finland is a good example where, the city of Helsinki essentially owns 3 or 4 different construction companies. The municipality just kind of outright owns these companies and kind of gives them directive to go to build this social housing. But those companies rent their housing at kind of at cost at which is below market rate. A lot of people who are low income, there's a universal monthly housing benefit that people below a certain income get, and so the rents are set kind of at the cost level to the housing company. There are some people who wouldn't be able to afford those rents just on their own, but because they get this housing benefit, they are able to afford those rents. And so that's a policy that somebody could get that housing benefit and take it to a private landlord, or they could take it to the public landlord. And with the public landlord, they're more likely going to get a little bit more bang for their buck than with a private one, depending on the circumstances. And so that's something that helps that program kind of operate. So I think they do and can go hand in hand.
All right. Well, since we've come up on time, I'm going to ask the traditional final question here, which is, what would you recommend for people who want to learn more? This could be a blog, a book, a person to follow on Twitter. Obviously, everybody should follow Paul on Twitter. He's a nice, thoughtful guy. But other than yourself, is there anything that you'd recommend for people who are interested in the topic?
Yeah, I mean, I recommended the book Modern Housing for America by Gail Radford, which came out about 20 years ago, but it really is a fantastic book that's kind of an overview of what people were thinking of and where, generally where the thinking on this topic was 90 years ago, during the New Deal, and how some of those ideas got thrown out by the politics. Really excellent history. I have some writing on this topic. Honestly, I think that Center for Public Enterprise is probably going to have a few reports kind of on this coming out in the next few weeks to a month, particularly on this kind of question of counter-cyclicality that I got to. Oh, and I did want to say one quick thing on that that I kind of missed earlier that I think ties a little bit of that together. So with Montgomery County, they're obviously a public housing authority, so they have their own kind of pipeline of projects that they want to build. But another thing that because they have this revolving fund, another thing that they're able to do is go out onto the private market and take a look at projects that are coming that are trying to be put together, and they one of the first projects they closed on with this new fund was a private developer who had done all of the architecture and engineering and site planning and entitled the land and done all these steps, but then it looked like they weren't going to be able to close the deal because there was issue with the financing, and so that was a project that would not have been built. Montgomery County Housing Authority came along and said, hey, I got financing. I'll do this project. I'm going to become the majority owner, and I'm going to make a bunch of your units lower rent, but I'll close the deal with you. And that developer was like, great, sure. They had already sunk all these costs in, and they just wanted to close the project. And so that's a situation, typically what you see with the public-private partnership is you have the public sector kind of take the risk, and you let the private sector take all the upside. This is a situation where, the public sector is taking some of the risk, but the public sector is also getting the upside, and making use of that private developer's development capacity to make this project happen, right? Like, all of that kind of engineering, architecture, site planning had already been done by this private entity. Public sector comes in, invests, and is the long-term steward of that asset. And there's a number of different ways that you can scale that up, and that you can think about stabilizing different kinds of projects. But I think that's a pretty potent example of how it could kind of work.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming on this week. I find myself probably in about the same position with public housing, but I feel like in researching this episode, I definitely learned a lot and know a lot more. And I do think it matters, if we're going to do this, the particulars of how we do it. I still find myself skeptical, but, if I was on a city council and had to put it up for a vote, right now we need units. Anything's good. Let's vote for it. So I want to thank you for coming on. I wish you all the best luck in your fight against the left NIMBYs. I think that this is a place where hopefully the center left and the left can ally, and you can just crush the left NIMBYs, and we can have a nice little political alliance here. So Paul Williams, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Jeremiah.